Okay, Part B, Lecture 6, Islamic Coinage in the Medieval Period. Now, before we get to the rise of Islam, though, we need to make note of the final non-Islamic empire in the Middle East, centered in Persia, and that was the Neo-Persian Empire from the early part of the 3rd century into the early to mid 7th century. This was the last Iranian empire before the rise of Islam. It was a rival to the Roman Empire, as you can see from the map. Very, very expansive. Covered Eastern Arabia, the Levant, Egypt, Pakistan, large parts of Turkey. Its economy relied heavily on the Silk Road, connecting China to the west. Silk exports, carpets, rugs, silver, pots and ornaments, but especially that re-export trade of Asiatic goods, spices, and silk, porcelain, trading those items to the west, acting as middlemen merchants, brought a lot of wealth to the Neo-Persian Empire, and as a result, quite a thriving coinage. And here, see gold coins, silver coins, some quite elaborate designs, and their unit of account they borrowed from the Roman denarius. And so here we have the unit of account that I've mentioned before, the dinar. The dinar, and to this day, many several Middle Eastern countries and North African countries use the dinar as their unit of account. Well, in the early part of the 7th century, Muhammad founded the Islamic religion, and after Muhammad's death in 632, his followers in those decades after, in the 7th century, waged major expansive conquest across the Middle East and especially in North Africa, but across the Arabian Peninsula, and established caliphates. And there were several caliphates. One of those caliphates was the Umayyad Caliphate, which was founded in 661 to the middle part of the 8th century. And you look there, all across North Africa, into conquer most of the Iberian Peninsula. They lost it shortly after. But for a while, the Caliphate controlled the Iberian Peninsula. Persia, there's the Byzantine Empire, no longer the power it once was by the 8th century. And then that was followed by the Abbasid Caliphate. So no more Iberian Peninsula, but still very, very large empire. This Umayyad Caliphate was the one of the largest in world history, or the largest for that time in the 7th century. They governed it. The Caliph appointed governors, provincial governors, who had semi-autonomy over their respective district. But many historians refer to this age, especially the 8th and 9th centuries, as the golden age of Islam. Islam reaches its territorial height during this period. Scientific achievements, cultural achievements, mathematical achievements. Of course, algebra comes from this period. Islamic art and music flourish significantly. Next to classical Athens in the 4th or 5th century BC, this is probably the most literate society or civilization that the world had yet seen in this pre-modern era. Thanks in part to the importation of Chinese paper. We'll see that next lecture. These caliphates, this Islamic civilization was able to preserve ancient Greek and Roman texts. So, we know what we know about Plato and Aristotle and some of those old Greek philosophers, primarily or even solely because those texts were preserved by these centers of learning in the early Islamic world. And in fact, pictured here is a university that was from this time in Baghdad. And Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries, may have been the most commercial city in the world at that time. Had a population of about 300 to 400,000, larger than any other city in the Near East or in Europe at the time. There were other cities in Iraq that had populations of more than 100,000 people, so this was a very commercial civilization, very urban civilization. We'll see very soon the use of coins was very prolific. Back when the Caliphate controlled the Iberian Peninsula, you see this city here, Cordoba. There was a university there, and it's specialized in classical learning, studying those old Greek and Roman texts. And a lot of European intellectuals during this dark period in European history actually traveled to Cordoba or even to Baghdad in order to study classical philosophy and science. Here's some more architecture from the period. There's some pottery from the period. Of course, very commercial society. They too are involved in the re-export trade of Eastern goods to the West. They're also heavily involved in the slave trade. We'll see in Part C of this lecture, African slaves bought and sold in Baghdad, and also European slaves from the Baltic region, or from the Balkan region, excuse me. And in Baghdad, actually, and through many of these other cities, you can almost describe as capitalistic. There were commercial organizations that arose that were entirely independent of the state, that resemble what you could call the modern corporation. Agricultural society, but centered very much on cash crops and international trade. Not surprisingly, there was money. This was one of the earliest, or it may have been the earliest, silver coinage issued by the Umayyad Caliphate in the middle of the 7th, I believe this is in the middle of the 7th century. By the 8th and the 9th centuries, this is what the coinage looked like, and it was gold and silver, a mixture of both. And you notice here the power again of iconography. On the obverse of these coins, of many of these coins, it said, "In the name of Allah." And then on the reverse, different phrases from the Quran were stamped on the coinage. You also note there's no images or faces on the coins, and this has something to do with just the hesitancy in Islam toward idolatry, right? Or this intense desire to avoid anything that might be idolatrous. And so you don't want to have the face of a human being stamped on the coinage. Now, in these early centuries of Islam to the present day, interest or usury is prohibited, strictly prohibited. These are two verses from the Quran. "O you who have believed, do not commit usury, doubled and multiplied, but fear Allah that you may be successful." That's from Surah 3. And then from Surah 2 in the Quran, "Allah has permitted trade and has forbidden interest." And that holds to the present day. Now, there's still banking, and there was still lending and borrowing in the medieval Islamic world to the present day. It's just done a little differently. It's a bit it's comparable to what you might call an equity stake in a business, or an investment, a direct investment, less so than lending plus interest payments. So if you loan money to somebody in the Islamic world, you're essentially investing in it so that whoever borrows that sum of money, if they end up, if there's a loss for their business, you as the creditor also incur that loss, right? The other way that borrowing is done with interest payments, if you're the creditor, you get paid back no matter whether there was a profit or a loss, irrespective of that. In the Islamic world, it works more like, again, an equity stake. or an investment. Quite a bit different. Now, as we'll see next week, in Christian Europe, usury was also prohibited for a very long time, until really the early modern age in Europe. But Islam has continued that stance. Okay, well, that wraps up part B. I'll see you for part C of Lecture 6.